You're watching Byline Wilmington on CBS 10 WILM. Here's your host, Donn Ansell.
Welcome back. Byline Wilmington this morning is focusing on the W presidency. The issue is legacy. Our guests are Dr. Candice Bredbenner, who is an associate professor of history at UNC Wilmington, and political scientist Dr. Stephen Meinhold from UNCW as well. The war in Iraq. Some say what happens there in the future will define the legacy, his legacy, the Bush legacy, more than anything else. Steve, would you agree with that?
Well, we're talking this morning about the W presidency. If you want to think about the W presidency and the war in Iraq, turn the W upside down and make it an M. Because most people in the United States today think that the war in Iraq was a mistake. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The explanations that were given for going into Iraq turned out to be not true. The intelligence was faulty. And then the post-invasion was bungled. It was a mess. It was
I've heard the president say that that he got rid of or that we got rid of a terrible dictator that was doing terrible crimes against his own people, and that he seeded democracy in the Middle East. Is that enough to resurrect his legacy about with Iraq?
So you said I thought you said he seeded democracy.
He says he has planted the seeds.
S-E-E-D, sorry.
Planted the seeds of democracy in the Middle
Right.
East. Okay. And if it takes, that's the accomplishment. Anything to that? Do you agree?
Well, I think that the jury is still out on that, and I think it'll stay out for quite some time. I mean, the question is whether the war in Iraq actually has helped combat the global war on terror, or in fact, it's given fuel to that war by the unpopularity of that war in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Yeah, there's been some discussion about a war of choice versus a war of necessity. Mm-hmm. Steve?
Well, one thing that's absolutely going to be true, though, in writing about this presidency and the war in Iraq was what the bill of goods that was sold to the American public was not what was delivered. And you can't fix that. You can't go back. Those tapes are there, the transcripts are there, and what Dick Cheney, what George Bush, what Colin Powell, what Condoleezza Rice said was going to happen didn't happen. And furthermore, I think what's equally problematic is that the president sold an international war, and what we bought was a domestic war. We fought this war from the beginning to the end with American lives, and there won't be any way to change that.
Well,
the rest of the world never really helped us.
Will history get on board with your perception?
Well, I think it's there now. I don't know where. I think it's hard to say where it will go, but it's going to take an awful lot of success in Iraq to offset the criticism of the president on not having the things that he said come true. And furthermore, I think really problematic is presidents are gauged in part by their in today's world, they're measured by their international sort of heft or weight. Do they measure up internationally? The president was not able to get other countries on board to help fight this war, either financially or with lives.
His supporters are quick to point out that he kept America safe post 9/11, and there were no more terrorist attacks on our soil. Will history take note of that?
Well, that's an undisputable fact. I think to go back to Steve's point a moment ago, that's just looking at the domestic front. This is supposed to be a global war on terror. If we look at the number of terrorist attacks abroad, those have increased, and I think that internationally the perception is that part of the problem is U.S. foreign policy, particularly in in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan.
Another big issue that came out of 9/11 and Iraq was the whole definition of torture and how America handles prisoners of war. Any comments on that, Steve?
I mean, this period may have the equivalent of the internment of Japanese Americans, may have the manner in which that we've treated African Americans in this country historically through slavery and other civil rights violations. I mean, these are serious matters, Reasonable people can disagree about whether something is torture or not, but I believe that when people write the story of this presidency, there's going to be an embarrassment about, in fact, the president himself has finally admitted that one of the mistakes was the way in which Abu Ghraib came about or was handled. I mean, he hasn't been very clear about what the mistake was, but clearly no one was happy about what happened.
Well,
to
those
Abu
pictures
Ghraib.
that came out. But what about holding prisoners in the name of national security indefinitely without formal charges and without due process?
Right, and again, because this is a war that could go on for many, many years, it has an indefinite end, that the idea of detaining people for how long? And this is exactly one of the questions
Is that a blight?
the
Is that a
Supreme
blight
Court
on
raised.
Well, there
You
is
know,
a Supreme Court decision pending on that issue, actually.
And the Supreme Court has already spoken on this to a certain extent, that you have to give basic due process rights to people, whether you identify them as unlawful enemy combatants or not.
Also, post 9/11 came the administration's claims of the right to spy on U.S. citizens. Any comments?
Another example of what Candice was pointing to earlier in terms of the expansion of presidential power, justifying it on terrorism and the war on terrorism. I think we're going to see a very different approach with the next presidency. I think that it's fair to say President Bush has pushed these matters really to the most extreme interpretation. And I do want to come back to something. Often in what appeared to be in a very political way, when they were trying to get the Domestic Surveillance Act reauthorized, they were at John Ashcroft's bedside to try to do it. You know, it was never done in the sort of transparent light of day. It was always done in a sort of partisan, behind the door, Dick Cheney in charge way. And I think that's really going to be harmful to his reputation historically, is that the way these things were done.
We're going to come back for our final segment, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Katrina, Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Alberto Gonzalez, Harriet Miers, and a few more. Stay with us.